Welcome to the last in our 2021 Zoom series. I'm Kate Wheeler, President and CEO of Crystal Cove Conservancy. Thanks to all of you for making this series such a success. Over the course of the series, we've had more than 500 people join us, and it really has been fun. We're already thinking about next year, and my background is the Education Commons because we're hoping to do this in person as well as broadcasting it next year. So we'll reach out to all of you to get your input on this year's series as well as ideas for next year. As always, we're glad you're with us tonight. Before we get started, a couple of notes for those on the call. You might want to put your questions, you'll want to put your questions in the chat as we go along, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. You also may want to set your view to speaker view. To do that, on the top right of your Zoom window, you'll see view. Click that and select speaker view rather than gallery view, and you'll probably have a better experience. So I'm really glad to have Angela Mooney D'Arcy, the founder and executive director of Sacred Places Institute for Indigenous Peoples, with us tonight. Angela, hi, thanks so much for joining us. Great to see you as always. Before I hand it over to Angela, I want to provide a bit of context for this talk in particular. The unceded lands and waters of the Acjachemen and Tongva tribal nations comprise what we now call Crystal Cove State Park. And we're deeply indebted to those nations whose members remain an important and valued part of our community today. On each of these talks, this is where I'd provide a bit of background on the Conservancy, who we are and what we aim to do. Tonight, for a couple of reasons, I want to skip that, and I want to talk instead about how we got here to this place at this time in this place for this talk. Crystal Cove Conservancy is, and has since its founding, been a white-led organization. And we grew up telling the story of Crystal Cove in a way that overlooked and frankly sometimes erased hundreds of years of history, whole cultures, and important events. It's not an indictment, it's just a reality, one that we as an organization are reckoning with. I want to share my screen for just a moment, if I can do this. Here we go. It's on my iPad, so I'm not as good at it. Okay, here we go. This land acknowledgement that you see here, that we include in all of our communications and all of our funding proposals that we've started each of these talks with, is fairly new for us. For a long time, we told the story of Crystal Cove without grounding it as the sacred and unceded lands and waters of the Acjachemen and Tongva tribal nations. For a long time, the Japanese language schoolhouse at Crystal Cove, which was built by Japanese Americans who were part of the community and worked the land as tenant farmers until they were forcibly removed and deported to internment camps during World War II. For a long time, we simply called it Cottage Number 34. Indigenous, Black, Latino, and Asian American and Pacific Islander communities have long led the way toward environmental justice here in Orange County and throughout our country. And at the Conservancy, we are committed to uplifting voices and perspectives that benefit the land through our collaborative work. So that's what we're here to do tonight, and that's what I'm really excited about. One of those voices is Angela Mooney D'Arcy. Angela is from the Acjachemen Nation, Juaneno Band of Mission Indians. She was born in her ancestral homelands, whose traditional territories include the area now known as Orange County, and raised in the ancestral homelands of the Osage, Kaw, and Wichita peoples. She's been working with Native nations, Indigenous peoples, grassroots and nonprofit organizations, artists, educators, and institutions on environmental and cultural justice issues for nearly 20 years. Angela is the executive director and founder of Sacred Places Institute for Indigenous Peoples, an Indigenous-led grassroots environmental justice organization. They're dedicated to building the capacity of Native nations and Indigenous peoples to protect sacred lands, waters, and cultures. She co-founded the United Coalition to Protect Panhi, an alliance of Acjachemen people dedicated to the protection of the sacred site Panhi. She serves on the board of the Blas Aguilar Adobe Museum and Acjachemen Cultural Center for nearly a decade. She received her BA from Brown University and her JD with a concentration in critical race studies and focus on federal Indian law from the UCLA School of Law. She currently lives and works in unceded Tongva homelands that we now know as Los Angeles, California. Angela, I'm so glad to be with you tonight, and I'm so glad that you welcomed us in working together to retell the story of this place, add Indigenous perspectives to our programs, and build our organization's capacity to be in allyship with you. And now, this is one of the reasons I didn't want to just jump into a lot about the Conservancy. I'd really like to just turn it over to you to talk to us about coastal justice and restoring those right relationships between people and place.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that introduction and for just really acknowledging the truth of history and where we're at now. And I really appreciated what you said about this not being an indictment, just being a reality. And I think especially in places like my homeland, like Orange County, I would encourage folks to really reflect deeply on that. In my work, I often encounter a lot of resistance and a lot of folks taking really personally, like something that is not personal, but is in fact historical and institutional. And so hopefully through this talk today, one of the things that can emerge for folks is the ways in which we are really dealing with systems of white supremacy and settler colonialism that are institutional and long-standing. And just thank you for the opportunity to share this space and this voice. You know, since I first learned about Crystal Cove and had the opportunity to visit, it's been a passion of mine to be able to bring my own people and Tonga people back to what is a very significant space in our homelands, but is a place that most of us have been quite alienated from. So with that, I will share my screen and get started. As soon as I figure out how to do that. Okay. So I titled this talk today, Reflections on Justice and Restoring Right Relationships Between People and Place. I think now is a really apropos time. Oh, I don't know why my screen's not. Give me a second. I'm gonna stop sharing for a minute because my PowerPoint is
wasn't advancing.
Yeah.
Technology.
Okay. Now it seems to be working, so hopefully now I lost you all though.
We could still have you, so you're good, I think.
Yeah, okay, so let's try this again. Sorry about that, that's never happened before.
No worries.
We'll see if we can get it to work. All right, here we go. So yeah, one of the reasons that I wanted to, you know, open this up broadly and talk about the word justice is just to name Black Lives Matter, and we did just hit the 1-year milestone of the death of George Floyd, murder by police. And so I hope that also by the end of my presentation, folks can appreciate this connection, which is often overlooked and not noticed between conservation efforts and policing and racial justice. But before I go any further, I really want to take a moment to honor my ancestors and allies and mentors, and also use this as an opportunity to reflect on the fact that for Indigenous peoples, our work in environmental justice is, it's not a career, it's not even a single lifetime. The picture in the center is at our sacred site, Panhe, and sadly, the majority of Acjachemen people in this photo are no longer alive. And many of them were, you know, carrying on the life's work of their parents and their grandparents. And so I think, you know, that is important to name in terms of it doesn't just benefit Indigenous peoples to have justice for Indigenous peoples. Everyone benefits in terms of the historical knowledge that Indigenous peoples bring to the table. And, you know, I also like to name, because I am coming to you from unceded Tongva homelands and what's now known as Los Angeles, that we should acknowledge where our water comes from. And the reality is that where I'm based, and to a large extent, you know, this applies to Orange County as well, our water is stolen from Indigenous peoples elsewhere, and specifically the Paiute and the Indigenous nations of the Colorado River. The photo on the left is of a colleague of mine, Anne Marie Mendoza, who's a Tongva scholar pursuing her PhD in urban planning at UCLA. And excuse me, the two individuals besides me are Paiute leaders in their community. And this is a talk that Anne-Marie organized at UCLA, connecting the theft of Paiute water in Owens Valley with the existence of, the urban built environment in Los Angeles on her homeland. And then the photo in the center is of our former chief and chair, David Villardis, who's no longer with us, but who is was instrumental in everything that I learned, both culturally and from the law and policy perspective in terms of how to be an advocate for my community. And the photo on the top is a photo in France, where our collective there was the only Indigenous presence at the World Water Forum. And so I want to include that as well as a reminder of how often Indigenous voices are excluded from spaces where we really need to be. And the slide at the bottom is from a talk that we gave with some of my fellow tribal members, Joyce Stanfield Perry and Charles Sepulveda, about cultivating consciousness on Indigenous homeland. And so I just want to acknowledge that there are many folks in my community who've been doing this work for lifetimes, and I am grateful for all of their support and all of their wisdom. Next, I want to talk about before there was a California. My hope is that as time passes and things like land acknowledgements become more and more common, that fewer and fewer people are surprised by this map. But I still always include it. It's a map of Indigenous California with the names of the people in our own languages. And as you can see, what's now known as California is an incredibly diverse place. There are over 150 sovereign native nations in what's known as California today. And I also just want to name that this map is a map created by Timara Loda Link, who's a Chumash basket weaver, and she's also a graphic designer. And so I like to include, things that are Indigenous created, and also to show that we don't exist solely in the past, right? Like we can be basket weavers and graphic designers and hold both of those things. And this is a map from the Blas Aguilar Adobe Museum and Acjachemen Cultural Center. This is a little bit south of where Crystal Cove is in what's now known as Dana Point. And I always include this slide because I think it speaks so profoundly to what Indigenous resilience looks like. The fact that we still maintain place names in our Indigenous language, despite the hundreds of years of attempted genocide, really speaks to our resilience. And I consider each one of these village names to be a marker of Acjachemen resilience in our homeland. And now we move from that happy piece about resilience to a less happy piece. I actually debated whether or not to include the photo in the center here. This photo was something that was sent to me by the administration at Chapman University, where I taught environmental justice this past semester. This was the first time in the history of Chapman that an environmental justice course was offered. And I was so excited and grateful to be a part of that, especially since I think it's pretty historic that the first time an environmental justice class was taught at this university, it was taught by someone from those homelands. So this photo was plastered, these signs were plastered all over Chapman campus. And so the Chapman administration sent them out to all the faculty and students to just warn them about white supremacy on campus. But ultimately, I decided to include this slide because I think I often encounter resistance in Orange County to me naming the ongoing existence of white supremacist settler colonial culture in my homeland. And I think, this photo says everything. The fact that it's something that I had to, receive that took place in my homeland and that actually has, the Nazi swastika symbol along with the term manifest destiny. And so, now I want to take a step back and talk about the other things that are on this slide. And that is really naming that this whole system, when I said at the beginning that I really appreciated these words around this not being an indictment, but a statement of reality. And so when we think of the United States, we really need to understand it in the broader context of settler colonial imperialism that existed for centuries before the United States. And in this papal bull created in 1452, I'm just going to read this. It directed King Alfonso to capture, vanquish, and subdue the Saracens, pagans, and other enemies of Christ, to put them into perpetual slavery, and to take all of their possessions and property. That, folks, is the roadmap for the creation of the United States of America. And I think it's really important for people to understand that this system is rooted in these notions of white supremacy and a desire to take land. And that really, when we talk about environmental justice, this is what we're battling against. And the quote on the right is the more recent iteration of Doctrine of Discovery, which is unique to the United States, manifest destiny. The belief that the U.S. has some unique moral virtue that other countries do not possess. The idea that the United States has a mission to redeem the world by spreading democracy and a divinely ordained destiny to accomplish these tasks. This is the route of Doctrine of Discovery and Manifest Destiny in California. Many of you from here, if you've gone on any sort of drive along the Pacific Coast Highway, you've seen these mission bells at different places. That's what's used as a state historical marker. And so I would encourage you to think about that and reflect on what that means for us California Indigenous folks, to know that the celebratory markers of history and culture in the state of California are those markers of the spaces of our first being conquered by settler colonists and those first acts of invasion, and then subsequent acts of enslavement, because California Indian people were enslaved at the missions. Some people, try to say that that wasn't a system of slavery and there wasn't an intent to do that, and all of the historical apologists. And, for us, Indigenous people, we viewed what we experienced as a system of enslavement. And there are many articles you can read by California Indigenous people documenting this history. And so I want to shift for a minute to talk about, because this talk is about people and place. And so I want to reflect on the ways in which settler colonialism and that history of Doctrine of Discovery isn't just a history of the racist violence that happened here. It's a history of violence against place, of ecological violence. In central Mexico, transformation of the landscape from introduced plant species took more than 300 years. But according to archaeological records at several missions, the same alteration was accomplished in just over 70 years, or in the course of a single lifetime. And so really, to think about the perspective of California Indigenous people who were overtaken and were forced into the mission system, to see such a dramatic ecological violent change in their homelands over the course of a single lifetime. And that settler state violence against Indigenous peoples continued when California became part of the United States. This is a quote from the first governor of California in his first inaugural address, where he calls for the genocide of California Indian people. That a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct must be expected. While we cannot anticipate this result, but with painful regret, the inevitable destiny of the race is beyond the power or wisdom of man to avert. And this call for our genocide was financially backed. Private militias in California formed to engage in Indian hunting expeditions. You can see this table 2 on the left. It lists out all of the Indian hunting expeditions that occurred in this 8-year time frame. And the table on the right, or the second column in that table, shows how much the state of California reimbursed these private militias for their Indian hunting expeditions. And the table next to that shows how much the United States government then reimbursed the state of California for the dollars it spent towards our genocide. This graph on the right is just a representation of, for inflation, what that total dollar amount would look like in today's dollars. And it would translate to a little over $14 million spent over the course of 5 or 6 years directed towards the genocide of a people. This is a quote from one of my elders and just an individual that I love dearly, L. Frank Manriquez. She's an Acjachemen and Tongva writer, artist, activist, an amazing person. And so her homelands include what's now considered Los Angeles, California, and what's considered Orange County. And I think it's such a powerful quote. It's difficult to be Indian under any circumstances. Think what it must be like to see a phenomenon like Los Angeles spreading over your meadows and valleys, diverting your rivers, building parking structures on your holy sites, transforming the land that nurtured your ancestors into something unrecognizable. And this is that unrecognizable that L. Frank speaks of in the previous slide. This photo on the left is from Tongva Homelands in what's now known as Long Beach, California. And I always include this photo because it's such a powerful representation from my perspective. For coastal people, the whales, dolphins, animals that live in the ocean are considered relatives. And so this is a reminder that, again, the violence done to our people in the name of colonization is a violence that was also wrought on the land and waters surrounding. And it's not just human people that are impacted and harmed by these systems. And this map on the right, put together by Frac Tracker and NRDC, hopefully looks a bit familiar to you, because if you know where the yellow and the orange dots are, this is where the most intensive extractive industries have been taking place over the state. And you'll see that this line coincides with the route of colonization. And so again, you have essentially from the 1400s onward, this radical displacement of worldviews, of the worldviews that allowed Indigenous people to live in right relationship with place since the beginning of time, according to our stories, or for at least 10,000 years, according to Western archaeological evidence. And either way, just to show that that mindset, again, is an institutional mindset, and it's a legacy that continues today and which BIPOC people still have to confront on a daily basis. And so now I want to shift slightly to talk about this violence and what it looks like in terms of pandemics and Indigenous collective resilience today. So just to put things in context, this is an article written by several Indigenous scholars reflecting on the connections between the pandemic and what Indigenous peoples experienced on this continent at the point of contact. Since the beginning of European colonization, new and highly infectious viruses such as smallpox, measles, and influenza have repeatedly whipsawed Indigenous communities of the Americas and Pacific Islands. Somewhere between 2/3 and 9/10 of the people on this continent died within 150 years of European arrival. And this statistic, I think, is something that all of us, because we all have collectively experienced this global pandemic over the past year and a half. And so I think probably everybody on this meeting has experienced loss of some sort as a result of the pandemic. And so it is my hope that what we have all collectively experienced contemporarily can help folks have some empathy for what my ancestors and other Indigenous ancestors experienced 150 years ago. And this statistic is to bring that reflection on the historical loss of life closer home and more specifically to California. So in the 65 years between the establishment of the missions in 1769 and their secularization by the Mexican government in 1834, more than 37,000 California Indians died at the mission. Around 15,000 of those deaths were due to epidemics aided by the mission's crowded conditions, while a significant number of the rest succumbed to starvation, overwork, or mistreatment. It's the same conditions that Indigenous peoples were forced into at the point of colonization that manifest again today and are the reasons why the COVID-19 pandemic is hitting Black and Indigenous communities the hardest in the United States, or that it did, and that's what the data plays out. So now I want to bring it back to place, and hopefully at this point, y'all are starting to see a theme in terms of my going back and forth between place and people. And one of the things that I have reflected on a great deal in the past year is what it means to be from a landless, non-federally recognized tribe during the midst of a global pandemic in which your homelands are an epicenter. And this photo on the left is something that many of you may have seen. It's a screenshot from a video that was shot in shared Acjachemen and Tonga ancestral homelands, now known as Newport Beach. And I was really torn by this video. It was released just a few weeks into the pandemic after the stay-at-home order had been issued in California. And so in one sense, it was just wonderful to see anything of beauty, right? And this is when the phosphorescence phenomenon was happening in the ocean, which causes the bioluminescence and creatures such as dolphins and the crashing of the waves to glow. And this photo was taken from a video which was captured by white men who were able to access a private yacht and go, in contradiction to the stay-at-home order and go out on the water and capture this footage. And again, I'm glad that they had the opportunity to do that. But what it caused me to reflect on was this point of access and who has it and how that access is related to wealth and related to class and related to race. I may be white passing, but many people in my family are not. And they couldn't have shown up at the beach on any given day under normal circumstances, but certainly not in the midst of a global pandemic where there are stay-at-home orders and in some instances even curfews. So there was a lot of privilege in who was able to appreciate the beauty of nature. And that's a common theme. There's class and race and privilege are tied to who can access nature and how. And I think that's something that's often overlooked. And the photo on the right is just a snapshot of some private access space to a river body. And I included that because for Indigenous peoples, often, prayer and prayer along the river is something that is essential and something that we're culturally obligated to do, especially during times of grief, especially during times of collective strife. And so to again understand that because we're landless tribes and we don't quote unquote own any of our own homelands, we were restricted from our cultural practices in many ways as a result of the circumstances that have arisen as a result of settler colonialism and invasion of our homeland. So what does coastal justice mean for Indigenous peoples? And this is where I get to talk about, the happy relationship that's emerging with Crystal Cove Conservancy. These photos were taken just a few weeks ago when my organization, Sacred Places Institute, was able to bring, a cohort of Acjachemen and Tonga tribal community members to Crystal Cove to be able to interact with a space that is an ancient village site and was a shared territory and is a place of much beauty, as those of you who have been understand. But for many people in this photo, this was the first time they'd ever been here. And, we went on the boat educational trip the day after we spent the day at Crystal Cove. And what we realized, the boat departed from Newport Beach, is that as far as we're aware, there's not a single Acjachemen or Tonga person that lives in Newport Beach. And yet this was a thriving place that was a significant portion of our homeland. So what does it mean to be alienated in that way from a place that is your birthright and that has been a place of importance to you and your people for thousands and thousands of years? So one thing that I think justice means for Indigenous peoples and that I think everyone can benefit from is this understanding of nature and all living entities as having life force. We don't look at rivers or oceans or rocks as things that are dead or inanimate. And understanding rights of nature is something that I think is going to be critical moving forward. As our earth gets more polluted and as, the consumption rages out of control, things like water are becoming more and more precious. Access to clean, healthy, safe water is essential, and yet it's not something that we talk enough about. This photo on the right is from the Earth Law Center, and it was posted on the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature website. It's a great site with a lot of resources. If you're interested in learning more about these movements that are happening from the local to the global around the world around recognizing the rights for nature. It's a good place to start. And I want to acknowledge here from Tonga elders of mine, some of whom are no longer with us, this statement about recognizing lands and waters as relatives, not resources. And that is fundamentally the paradigm shift we need in order for all of us to survive and for places like Crystal Cove to continue to be places of natural beauty that we can access. So what does justice mean for Indigenous peoples? It means free, prior, and informed consent. This is the standard set forth in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which was adopted by the UN in 2007. It was officially supported by the United States in 2010, adopted by the California Assembly Joint Resolution 42 in 2014, and ratified by the Organization of American States in 2016. So I include all that to say that in a place like Crystal Cove, because it's in California, because it's in the United States, there's actually this rich potential to do something far more meaningful than simply consulting with a tribe. This is about establishing real relationships, consent-based relationships around lands and waters and what happens in our homeland. And ultimately, fundamentally, what justice means is land back. And, you know, there's a growing movement among agencies and government entities and private individuals to support tribal land return. These are some of the articles from the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that deal specifically with this idea of land return. And a little closer to home, this was adopted by Governor Newsom less than a year ago. This is the state of California's official administrative policy on Native American ancestral lands. And you can read here in the quote that this is the state prioritizing things like co-management and access to natural lands, and even to work cooperatively with California tribes that are interested in reacquiring these natural lands. And so I include, you know, these statements from the UN and the state of California to show that this idea of land return isn't some pie in the sky mythological thing. It's something real that is being done and accomplished around the country. Here are some examples of land back campaigns. There's the Indian Collective Land Back campaign that's relatively new, but you know, takes on to a long body of this work happening throughout California and around the world. In Northern California, in what's now known as the San Francisco area, you have the Ohlone Shumi Land Pact, which is manifested in the creation of the Sogorea Land Trust, which is an Indigenous women-led land conservancy that's being able to do great things right now. And then you have more in Southern California, the Native American Land Conservancy, which has been operating for over 25 years, and they have reacquired hundreds of acres of tribal ancestral lands to protect it from development and protect sacred sites. And then even more recently, and much closer to home, you have the establishment of the Acjachemen Land Conservancy, on which I'm honored to serve as a board member. And so now I want to talk about just down the street from Crystal Cove in the final minutes of my talk. This is our current tribal chair, Matt Ballardis, along with Joyce Stanfield Perry, who I mentioned is one of my mentors, Charles Sepulveda, who's a Tonga and Acjachemen scholar, and my little cousin Wyatt. And this is after the Coastal Commission hearing on the Banning Ranch project, when the Coastal Commission denied the project permit, and they did so in part specifically on the grounds that these were Acjachemen and Tonga lands that were significant, and that the entities had not engaged in appropriate government-to-government consultation. So our ties to this land was really a big part of the reason why we still have one of the last remaining open spaces. And as you've seen recently, this area, which is called Banning Ranch, but it was the village of Genga, which was a shared village site for Acjachemen and Tonga people. And it's recently been in the news because now the property owner is willing to sell the land. The Trust for Public Land is currently in negotiations to come up with the remaining funds needed to buy back the land and ultimately have it turned into a land conservancy. And so, again, I mentioned that we have established the Acjachemen Land Conservancy. So we have an intertribal entity that would have the capacity to take on this land. And that would be so historic because this would be the first return of land in our shared ancestral homelands in this portion of Orange County. And I wanted to leave a few resources here. I mentioned Charles Sepulveda, and you saw a couple of pictures of him. This article that he wrote, Our Sacred Waters, Theorizing Puyum as a Decolonial Possibility, focuses on the Santa Ana River and the mission period, and specifically the imprisonment of California Indigenous women, children, and gender nonconforming peoples. And so the connections he makes there are really important, and I encourage you to check out that article. And for those of you interested in learning more about Indigenous perspectives on this idea of a just transition, Indigenous Environmental Network is one of the oldest nationally recognized Indigenous environmental justice orgs in the country. And so they've developed in collaboration with many Indigenous peoples this framework. Resource Generation is an amazing organization that works with young people of wealth to redefine what relationships to place in people and empowerment look like. And they have a land reparations and Indigenous solidarity toolkit that I encourage you all to check out if you're interested in exploring this topic in greater detail. And then finally is this article that this photo is a part of, written by my friend Hop Hopkins last summer in the wake of the social justice uprisings that were taking place around the country. And this is just simply Racism is Killing the Planet. And so I encourage you all to check that out because Hop makes very clear the links between doctrine of discovery, enslavement of people in the United States via the transatlantic slave trade, and the attempted genocide of Indigenous peoples in what's now known as the United States. And then finally, I'll end with this quote from Charles Sepulveda. And Exla Pomaachay is how you would say land back in Acjachemen. So I've started including that as well too, because it's important that we reclaim our languages in addition to everything else that has been lost. I would like to end with a simple and yet incredibly complex ask. Please give our land back. This request is radical, and yet there shouldn't be anything radical about it. If people can acknowledge that it was stolen, then they can give it back. And that is all I have. This is my contact info. If you take a picture of that barcode, it will take you directly to our website. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop screen sharing and I think open it up to some Q&A.
Yeah, fantastic, Angela. Thank you so much. It really is so great to talk to you and hear more about your work and the issues Indigenous people are facing and how all of us can be a part of solutions, a part of changing that. So I want to shift now to some questions and answers. I'll do questions, you do answers. I think that'll work best. If all of those of you on the call do have questions, feel free to put them in a chat. I'll keep in the chat. I'll keep an eye on it as we go along here. But let's start with Sacred Places Institute for Indigenous Peoples. One of the focus areas in your work is sacred ecologies, where you work on environmental and cultural protection campaigns with Native nations. You talked about banning ranch a bit. And I'd like to talk about that a little bit more. Will you tell us about one or two of those campaigns so that people get a real sense of what the work looks like?
Sure. So our Sacred Ecologies program really is the heart of why I founded Sacred Places Institute. And that was to directly support Native nations and Indigenous peoples to protect sacred places. Even though as Indigenous peoples, our cultural mindset is one that mandates looking 7 generations ahead for the future, planning your decisions. I mean, and that's how Indigenous cultures were able to exist sustainably in one place for so long because of this thinking towards the future. But the nature of settler colonialism and the rapidity with which development has taken place in our homelands means that for most Indigenous nations, there's the onslaught and threat to our sacred sites and places of cultural importance is so severe that there's not time to reflect or think strategically in the long run. And it's just people responding rapidly to whatever threats are coming up in the immediacy, right? And so Sacred Places Institute, one of the things we do is when tribes or indigenous communities have a need, they can contact us. So like we have a media team. Years ago, we worked with the Paiute because the LA Department of Water Resources was intending to put an industrial scale solar farm on an area that was right across the street from Manzanar, and then also a place that would have destroyed many cultural sites. So we worked with the Paiute to put together a short info film so that they could get their perspective out there, and ultimately they were able to stop the project. Last year, under the Trump administration, when the border wall was still being built, it was, being built through Pomaachay Homelands, and the Pomaachay are on the border of what's now known as San Diego and Mexico, but their tribe extends on both sides of the border. And so not only was that wall going to harm and destabilize the tribal community, it also was going to go through an area that was a burial ground. And so we had members of our team at SPI show up in solidarity and be there for direct actions on the border wall. So sometimes it takes the form of direct action, but other times it's more policy oriented. Like right now, Los Angeles County is doing a countywide needs assessment for all of the open spaces and beaches and harbors in LA County that are owned by the county. And they want to understand better what equity looks like for these places. And yet until Sacred Places Institute got involved, they hadn't had any engagement with Native nations or Indigenous peoples. And yet, especially for those of us from landless tribes, the places that are county or state or federally owned are often the last open spaces, the last places where our sacred sites haven't yet been desecrated. So the idea that this entire report could have been proceeding absent, meaningful engagement with Indigenous peoples is really a travesty. And so that would be like a more policy-oriented example of the kinds of work that we do with the Sacred Ecologies program. And I'll stop there because I haven't had a chance to read the questions, but I saw a lot of questions coming up.
Yeah, so there was a question in the chat about justice and accountability. And in thinking about justice, do you think we can have justice without accountability? And thinking about the quote from Charles Sepulveda, how do we encourage that kind of accountability? How can we all be a part of helping this idea of land return take hold, get more traction? Because I think for a lot of people, when they hear land return, they think, oh, how's that ever going to work? And so can you talk a little bit more about that link between justice and accountability, and what folks can do to move the idea of land return forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think, one thing I've been teaching at various universities for probably the past 15 years. And one thing that gives me a lot of hope is that I've seen a real shift in the student bodies from when I first started teaching to now. When I first started teaching, I would encounter a lot of resistance and people tending to take very personally critiques about institutional racism or white supremacist culture. And, you would hear a lot people saying, well, but I didn't own slaves, or I wasn't around then, and so why am I being punished for something that I didn't have anything to do with? And when people are at that point where they're taking something as a personal attack, they become resistant and shut down, and it's really difficult to move forward in any kind of meaningful way. Once someone feels attacked, it's hard to have a real conversation to open things up and move forward. And so what I've seen change over the years is now I don't encounter that kind of resistance. I think that young people today regardless of race, have a much better understanding of the existence of things like institutional racism and how that is influencing and shaping and driving society and maintaining inequities that are longstanding and continue to be perpetuated today. Because people can understand those issues as systemic and not personal in nature, I think that there's a lot more openness to work together collectively, because that's not, those systems of oppression and domination, nobody really benefits from that. I mean, you have like the 1% that maybe gets wealthier and gets to buy another yacht, and so I guess in some sense they benefit, but like on a broader philosophical perspective, nobody benefits from systems of domination and subjugation like that. And I think it's directly related to this issue of accountability. People have to be willing to have those hard conversations, and they have to be willing to do as you did in the beginning of this, which is say that, you know, this isn't an indictment, this is just a reality. Because if you're fighting, you know, the truth of what's transpired, then you're not going to be able to understand those as legacies which have lasting impacts and still are harming BIPOC folks today, right? And if we can't get to that, then we can't get to a future where everyone is empowered and no one has to, you know, suffer from the institutional gaze and violence of settler colonialism that's racialized.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk a little bit about sovereignty because I think it's an idea that most folks haven't given a lot of thought to. And I was reading an article recently by Nick Martin in the New Republic, who is a Saponi reporter who covers Indian country. And he intended to look at how media coverage of Indigenous issues has shifted since the Dakota Access Pipeline protests. And he acknowledged that the media is giving more column inches to these issues. But it ended up where he was really, he led readers to wrestle with sovereignty demand, with what sovereignty demands of us. We'll put a link to the chat in the article, but I want to just read a piece of it, and then I'd love to know your thoughts about it, Angela. Now, Native people are no longer an afterthought for the climate desks of our nation's largest outlets, hence pieces like the Times lithium exploration. But tribal citizens and nations are not quite the focus either. Rather, the industry seems to be in something of a limbo at the current moment. The most prominent news stations, newspapers, magazines have decided that including Indigenous voices in their stories is worthwhile and necessary, but granting Native journalists editorial power in their newsrooms and centering Native subjects and sources in their produced narratives still seems a bridge too far. And that really resonated with me, because what I thought about was, we're doing work to retell the story of the place, to include Indigenous perspectives in our programs. Maybe that's just column inches and it's not editorial power. So talk to us about sovereignty, what it means, what it looks like when folks really understand it, and how power is central to sovereignty.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I would agree with that journalist. There's this way in which, I mean, and I'll take land acknowledgements as an example. It's become all the rage, land acknowledgements, you know, and I know that there are a few out of UCI just down the street, some of which the departments that created them should quite frankly be embarrassed because they don't even bother to acknowledge or name the specific tribe whose lands they're on. One time, my colleague and I were at a Zoom virtual session on a just transition, and the government agency that had convened the meeting started with a land acknowledgement. But it was surreal because they started with a land acknowledgement and yet had not invited anyone from the tribes who they were naming and acknowledging to participate in the actual meeting on a just transition. And so there's this way that there's just this fundamental disconnect where I think for many people, Indigenous peoples and nations remain ethereal. We're ghosts from another era. And, you know, you don't offer a ghost a seat at the table, right? And so, you know, and that has to do with power. When I teach, I always ask people, you know, if they can identify whose ancestral homelands the university where I'm teaching is on. And, it's gotten better over years, but typically, like, in a class of 150, maybe one or two people will know whose homelands they're on. And then the second question I ask is, raise your hand if you can explain what in manifest destiny means. And then pretty much every hand in the room goes up. And I say, it's precisely because you can answer that second question. That's why you can't answer the first, right? Meaning that the project of settler colonialism, the erasure of Indigenous people is central to that. And so you have to mythologize us and tokenize us and make us figments of the past, right? Because to the extent that we exist in the present, then that destabilizes existing power structures because we have a prior claim to place. And if you recognize us as existing in a sovereign nations in our own right today, then that puts something in the path of the system that is built up and developed and benefited from our exclusion and our erasure. And so I think, relatedly, it's complicated because tribal nations are sovereign nations in the same way that any nation is a sovereign. And I often hear environmentalists say, well, we want to talk to all the stakeholders, including Native American tribes. And that always irks me because tribes aren't stakeholders. Our claims, we have prior claims to these lands, and we never ceded these lands. We never gave them up, right? And so for Indigenous peoples, these remain our homelands. And so it's not just do a land acknowledgement or make sure you invite an Indian to the meeting. It's got to be something deeper and more substantive than that. And I think, to speak to what people can do, especially around this idea of land return and particularly related to the site of Genga, I know that what I've encountered when I raise the issue of possibly returning these sacred lands and village sites, one of the last remaining open spaces on the coast in Orange County, to a tribal land collective, is people often question the irony, right, that we live sustainably in place for thousands of years, but today people question our capacity to actually manage the land or to steward it. And so I think one thing that people can do to be good allies is to push back on that. If you hear people going down this narrative that diminishes or calls into question the capacity of Acjachemen and Tonga people to manage our own homelands, maybe push back on those entities and ask them to, justify that. Why? Why do they think that we lack that capacity? Because of course we don't lack that capacity. Then that's what sovereignty is. And that's what we have not only the capacity, but we have the proof in the fact that California looked the way it did at the point of contact. Meaning we've been here for thousands of years, and once Western society came here within the span of a couple hundred years, we're almost at the brink, right? And so our proof of our capacity to steward and be in right relationship with land is in, the realities of what this place looks like at the point of contact versus what it looks like 200 or 300 years after that point of contact.
Right. So there's a question in the chat for the Conservancy, and the question is from Aaron, and it's, does your Conservancy have an interest in engaging with state and federal natural resource agencies to acquire land set aside for mitigation in perpetuity that are associated with impacts to their culture? So there are a lot of mitigation, are we interested as a Conservancy in supporting land return through these mitigation actions? And I think the reality is we have to be. Like, if we want to be in allyship with Indigenous people, if we want to recreate access to Crystal Cove, to what we now know as Crystal Cove, then we have to be a part of that. We are, it's interesting. I'm at Crystal Cove, you're not. And it's a thing that we wrestle with. And as I said at the beginning, we have always been a white-led organization, and we are at a bit of a reckoning point here. And I just wonder, what your thoughts are on how organizations like ours can work with state governments, with federal agencies, those folks, to work toward having lands set aside in perpetuity and returned. Is there, I guess, just your advice on what that would look like for our organization? And I think the other question, the other piece of that for me is, I wasn't the one within our organization that created the relationship between the Conservancy and Sacred Places Institute. That was our education team. It was Holly Fletcher, Sarah Ludovice, Eric Valdez. It was those folks. And honestly, they have been leading us in equity work for a long time. And now we're taking it up as a whole organization. So I wonder, what was it about their approach to you, to Sacred Places Institute, that has made this relationship work, this collaboration, and work in the way that it has? And because we want to know what that is so we can do better, do more, and support you as, the tenant on these lands.
I mean, I think really it's the willingness to be self-aware and recognize yourself as guests on Indigenous lands. In the article by Charles Sepulveda that I referenced, that's what the word kuyum means. It means guest in Tongva. And that's essentially what he was asking people to do, is reflect on how can you be good guests on Indigenous homelands. So I think, the fact that you all were there and willing to ask that question and be reflective in that way is huge. And I think also the other thing is that you're actually prioritizing working with Native nations. A lot of people will give lip service to it, but at the end of the day, it's not that hard. It's not that hard to call me up. It's not that hard to reach out to Sacred Places Institute. But it has to be a priority for the organization in order to make that relationship happen. Because, I'm busy and overworked, and Native-led orgs get less than, I think, 0.5% of all foundation dollars that go to support environmental issues in the United States. So we're always scrambling for resources, and we're always far under-resourced from our, the mainstream environmental orgs, who tend to be white-led and certainly don't have Indigenous folks in the driver's seat, right? And so it takes time to develop relationships, and it takes work. And what I find often is that people give lip service to it, but when it becomes hard, they stop, right? And that means that working with Indigenous peoples isn't actually a priority for that organization. And I would also suggest for organizations that, think that you want to start working and being in right relationship and allyship with tribes, really do that deep reflecting first before you reach out to find out if the organization really is at that place and is ready to do that. Because myself and pretty much every other BIPOC folks I know in this movement, it can get exhausting. The number of people that want to have meetings or calls with us just to pick our brain and explore what it might look like to be in right relationship. And that's time and energy and emotional labor. And if at the end of the day, we spend an hour or 2 hours or 5 trying to help an organization get there, but they're not in fact ready to be there, then that makes it that much harder for us to be trusting and to build out these relationships in the future. So I think it's, one, a willingness to be self-reflective and really take seriously this idea of being a guest on someone else's homeland, and 2, being willing to prioritize the building out of those relationships, and not having, 3 would be not having a predefined agenda. Because often, what becomes clear after 1 or 2 meetings with people is that they don't really want to work with us as partners. They already have something created or designed, and they want us to just come in and fill in the little slot that they've already designated. And that's not what being in right relationship looks like.
Yeah. Well, we are basically out of time, but Angela, thank you. I appreciate you. I appreciate the work that you do in the world, and I feel really fortunate to be able to learn from you and uplift your work and be in allyship with you. Part of the commitment we've made as an organization in our equity work is to expand the resources of Indigenous, Black, Latino, LGBTQ, and disabled-led organizations. We don't simply want to collaborate together, we want to create resources for others and put our own resources behind this work. And in this case, by resources, I specifically mean money. We often ask you, those of you on the call, to make donations to support the work of the Conservancy. And really, you do all the time. Thank you. We are so grateful for that support. But tonight I want to do something a little bit different. And I'd like to ask those of you on the call to consider making a gift directly to support Sacred Places Institute. In particular, they're working to raise funds to support their Elders Indigenous Climate Fellowship that they're launching in partnership with Climate Science Alliance. We've put a link in the chat. The fellowship aims to support a tribal elder to participate, advise, and support the Climate Science Alliance partners to elevate and incorporate these critical voices, perspectives, and the deep knowledge that comes from Indigenous communities into their projects and programs. So I'd really like to ask each of you to consider making a gift that feels meaningful to you directly to Sacred Places Institute and Climate Science Alliance to support that work. Angela, thank you for the work you do in the world and for allowing us to support that work and be a part of it. I have loved getting to know you. I am really endlessly grateful to my colleagues, Holly Fletcher and Sarah Ludevice, for cultivating this relationship, and to our entire education team, because as I said, they have been committed to changing the way that we think about our work at the Conservancy and linking it inextricably with equity. They've led our organization in this work. They're my constant sounding boards and advisors, and we're a better organization for it. So I thank all of them. Many of them are on this call. And I thank you, Angela. And I think that is a wrap for our 2021 speaker series. We're so glad that you were our final act in that series, Angela. And thanks to all of you who have logged on each month and learned with us. We're already planning for next year. And until then, we'll see you around the park. Good night, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks, Angela.